My name is Richard McFahn and I have been a history teacher and history educator for the last 25 years. Golly, that makes me sound ancient. I presently work at the University of Sussex leading the History Initial Teacher Education course. I also run the website History Resource Cupboard, which provides adaptable, downloadable resources for history teachers. Anyway, thanks so much for inviting me to speak at the Scottish Association of Teachers of History conference. Today, I'm going to discuss why it is important to embed historical scholarship or historical interpretations into your history curriculum, and I'm going to show you a few examples of how you might do this. So before we look at some examples of how to embed historical scholarship or interpretations into our curricula, let's consider why it's actually an important thing to do. So this essentially is the theory bit. I don't know if you recognise this chap. This is Professor Michael Young. He seems to have become very popular with some influential history educators in England in the last 10 years, and his ideas seem to have been partly favoured by influential ministers in the Department for Education in England. In a nutshell, he argued that a school curriculum should provide pupils with what he phrased powerful knowledge. And apparently this is the best knowledge we have in each subject, and this knowledge should be taught to all pupils, not some pupils. And this powerful knowledge comes from the different academic disciplines, i.e. history, and it acquires its authority from its specialist communities of researchers in each of those disciplines, so historians. So Young argues that all pupils have a right to be able to access this powerful knowledge via a school curriculum. And he argues that this powerful knowledge should be consistent with the disciplines where new knowledge is produced, i.e. in universities. So therefore, the history we teach in schools should reflect academic history. So a good starting point is to ask ourselves, what is history and what is history now? Well, if we turn to historians who've discussed what history is, there seems to be some agreement over what the subject actually is, particularly presently. So if we go back in time, Leopold von Ranke in the 1830s wanted historians to simply show how it really was. Essentially, he wanted to tell a mono-narrative story. Fine for the time, but this approach, according to E.H. Carr in 1961, was a preposterous fallacy. And Carr was very important. In 1961, Carr argued that history consists of a corpus of ascertained facts. The facts are available to a historian in documents and inscriptions and so on, like fish on a fishmonger's slab. Historians collect them, take them home, and serve them up in whatever style appeals to him. So essentially, Carr was arguing that history is interpretation. And although historians do follow a method, they come to conclusions about the past on their own. They're influenced by the time they write and the sources they select, and essentially they construct the past. Now, if you know your history of history, Geoffrey Elton in 1967 seemed to disagree with Carr, and he felt that historians can be objective. But since then, to my mind anyway, others seem to agree that history is an interpretation and it is constructed. Keith Jenkins in 1991 separated the past, which is gone, with history, which is constructed by historians. In a Reith lecture in 2017, Hilary Mantel argued that history is not the past, it's the method we have evolved of organising our ignorance about the past. And popular TV historian Lucy Worsley, in a recent documentary series on America, said this: history is usually presented as a set of facts and dates of victories and defeats or monarchs and presidents, consigned to an unchanging past. But it's not like that at all, she said. History is the knitting together of rival interpretations, deliberate manipulations of the truth, and sometimes alternative facts. So, our historians here seem to agree. So there seems to be clear agreement on what history is in the academy, i.e. a construct and interpretation. And in fact, in this recently published book, Carr and Lipscomb state that history is above all interpretation. Therefore, shouldn't we be teaching pupils to understand this? Don't get me wrong, I do want pupils to gain other aspects of historical literacy, as perhaps outlined by Peter Lee. He thought that pupils should understand how interpretations are constructed, they should be respectful of evidence and view people in the past with respect, and pupils should be provided with a big picture or a framework that allows them to orientate themselves in time. But I think pupils should spend some of their time evaluating how and why interpretations of the past are constructed. So, having talked some theory, I thought we'd look at an example. Now, these examples are just my ideas, or other people's ideas that I like. You can like them or loathe them, but I think it's good to see them as a starting point. So, one example that I used to use with younger pupils in year 7 or 11 to 12-year-olds, was to get them to debate how historians actually write and how they should write, using Ranker and Simon Schama. So, what I used to do was I'd tell them a narrative story. And the story I chose to tell them was the story of the execution of Richard Whiting, who was abbot in Glastonbury in 1539. Now, poor Abbot Whiting was hung, drawn and quartered on Glastonbury Tor. And he was hung, drawn and quartered because he didn't want his monastery shut down. He hadn't really done anything wrong, but we get into that later on. So what I did with my year 11 and my 11 and 12-year-olds is I simply told them the story of his execution in what I thought was a Rankian manner. So I simply tried to show them how it was. So I told them this story of him being hung, drawn and... So the story starts like this. In November 1539, a man in his 80s was executed. His name was Richard Whiting. Outside Glastonbury Abbey, Whiting was tied to a hurdle, and this was then tied to the back of a horse's saddle. The horse dragged the old man along the ground, and he passed the inhabitants of Glastonbury. So I told the story like that, and then I told them that some historians, like Simon Schama, write beautifully and bring history to life through their skills of storytelling. So my pupils' task was to do this. They had to make valid inferences to bring this story to life. So rather than writing in November 1539, we'd talk about how we could kind of make an inference there. So on a cold November morning in 1539. And then, rather than just an old man in his 80s, well, he was probably quite frail. So on a cold November morning in 1539, a frail old man in his 80s was gruesomely executed. So I gave them some guidance on how to write their story, and they would embellish their story, and I gave them some contextual knowledge that they could add to make the story sound better, but obviously I didn't want them to make things up. Then they read each other's stories, and they decided which was better, their versions or my original version. And we had a chat about why they thought their version might be a improvement on my original story. Then I'd introduce Leopold von Ranke, who I told them would have probably disliked this new embellished story, because he said historians should only write how things actually happened. Next, I introduced other historians like Simon Sharma, who look at the evidence and construct their view of the past, but do use fancy pants words in their storytelling. And I told the pupils that he would have liked our embellished version. And then what I did with my my 11 to 12-year-olds is I would just discuss with them what they thought, which was the better history. Was it the first version or was it the second version? And we used to have some really, really good discussions, thoughtful discussions with 11 and 12-year-olds about this. So, just an example. So let's return to a bit more theory now. So I'm sorry to talk about England, forgive me, but it is the context that I work in. So in England, since historical interpretations were introduced as a concept in the first version of our national curriculum in 1991, there seems to have been a lot of confusion about what interpretations actually are or what an interpretation actually is. And teachers, time and time again, seem to have confused working with interpretations with working with contemporary sources. And the two are subtly different. Some people have tried to define what interpretations are, and I don't think they've actually helped. So what do you think of these? So this is from Cassidy, Flaherty and Fordham. They define historical interpretation as an attempt to say something meaningful about the past. Bit vague? I think it's vague. Another definition comes from Arthur Chapman, who in a chapter of the first edition of Debates in History defined an interpretation, or says, understanding interpretations involves thinking critically about the diverse ways in which human beings and societies make sense of time and change. Now, that's quite interesting, but it's quite difficult to get hold of. The third definition comes from Byram, Council and Riley at a conference in 2004. And I think this is a bit clearer. They say how people in later times have reconstructed and presented the past. But what do they mean by later times? Is that difficult thing? The definition that I really like is probably the original definition from Tony McAlevey in 1993. And he said that interpretation is a conscious reflection on the past and not the ideas and attitudes of participants in past events. Now, I really like McAlevey's definition because he makes a clear distinction between it being a reflection on the past not made by participants of the past. So people are constructing history who were not there, okay, who weren't at the original event. And I think that it's a good definition. However, I would warn us against getting drawn down the blind alley of thinking, of discussing how long should we have to wait between the event and the interpretation. A simple way around this is to provide interpretations to your pupils that are quite a long way in time from the event you are studying. Also, it's important that we must be clear that some things might appear to us to be interpretations, but they are not interpretations. So questions like these are not really interpretations questions. Questions like, Haig was the butcher of the Somme. How far do you agree? Or do you think King John was the worst ever king? Do you think King John was the worst ever English king on the throne? Now, what these questions are doing is they're asking pupils to make an evaluative judgment and come to their own interpretation of the past. We come to our own interpretation of the past when we answer a why question. That's our view. It's not the view of someone else. It's not an interpretation created by a historian. What we should do with interpretations is we should evaluate and analyse real interpretations or real scholarship. So what types of interpretations could we get our pupils to analyse then? Well, to stop me just talking at you for the length of my input, why don't you grab a pen and spend 30 seconds writing down the different types of interpretations we could get pupils to analyse. I'll start you off. 2 examples. We could obviously get pupils to analyse historians' work, but that can be difficult. We can also get pupils to analyse school history textbooks accounts as interpretations. What others can you think of? So how did you get on? I wonder if your list is better than mine. But here's a list that I use with my trainees. So we can have academic interpretation, so books and journals of professional historians. We might have excavation reports. We might have lectures. We can, as I said, we can look at textbooks. I think it's really good to use museums as interpretations. We can look at battle reconstructions. We can take TV documentaries. We can take extracts from websites. There's fiction as well. We can look at historical fiction and novels. We can look at paintings as long as they're reflecting on an event that happened after it was painted, quite a long time after it was painted. We can look at plays. We can take feature films. We can take TV, drama, TV comedy. In the past, Blackadder has been a hugely popular interpretation to use. We could look at theme parks or souvenirs or monuments as well. Adverts. I really like using plaques that are put up to commemorate people's lives where they lived in a house, or events that were important to a town or a city. We can also evaluate computer games that have a historical kind of theme, like Assassin's Creed, for example. So there's so many different forms of scholarship or interpretation that we can use in our classes to evaluate with our pupils. So although there has been confusion about what interpretations are, there seems to be a consensus in the history education literature in the types of analysis we should get pupils to engage in when it comes to teaching them about historical interpretations. This diagram here summarises the kind of agreement in the literature, and essentially this diagram is based on what Tony McAlevey said in his article in Teaching History in 1993, and others have built on that really. But if we start on the left hand side, we should get pupils to understand that historians construct the past from evidence, and that these are separate from the past, so that interpretations are constructed. And they should know that historians' accounts and film clips and songs and documentaries are actually interpretations. Then if we move to the second box on the left, we should spend some time working out what an interpretation says or shows, or what message does it seem to be giving overall. And we can do this in a number of ways. We can take it at face value and we can think about what's it saying explicitly, face value, what's it saying. We can then dig in and look in a little bit more detail about implicitly what does it seem to be subtly suggesting. We can look at the style it's written in or made in. And with historians' work, we can look at the words they use and the sentences they use, and we can kind of evaluate the tone of it as well. So we can spend some time digging into the message, how it's written, the style and tone that it's written in. We can then sometimes consider, when we take an interpretation, which parts of the interpretations are factual, which parts are the point of view of the historian or the constructor, and have they actually made anything up? Okay, so we can use our own knowledge to look at things which are factual, which are points of view, and which are imagined. And an important thing to do, we can compare the interpretation to the available evidence. Now, I know some history teachers have actually taken the work of a historian and then looked at the evidence that they based that page or two on in the footnotes, and then provided the pupils with that evidence, and then they've seen if they agree with the interpretation that the historian has come to, which is quite interesting stuff. It's also important at points to get your pupils to consider what was the purpose of the interpretation and who was the audience. And finally, and some people, perhaps going back to E.H. Carr, think that this is hugely important. We shouldn't just look at what the interpretation says and how it's written and compare it to the available evidence or compare it to our own knowledge. We should actually understand the context in which the interpretation itself was written. So what was going on at the time that the historian or whoever was writing? Is there anything that influenced them? And some people call this double vision. I think Jane Card called it double vision, which is quite an interesting slant. And I think that this is important, but I also think it's very difficult to do in a tightly packed curriculum. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. So this essentially is your guide to teaching historical interpretations. And I would say that you can't do all of this in one lesson or in a 3-hour inquiry. It's important that over the course of your curriculum that you select a couple of these things, and when you're focusing on interpretations, you teach explicitly the 2 or 3 types of analysis that you want to do here. And then when you have another interpretations rich inquiry, you might take some of the types of analysis here that you haven't done. So over time and over the course of your curriculum, your pupils are really getting their teeth into all the different types of analysis that you want them to think about when it comes to historical interpretations. How then might we teach these different aspects of historical scholarship or historical interpretations? Well, I thought it might be a nice idea to have a look at some examples. And as I said before, these are just examples that I've seen that I like and that I have used myself, that work well with the pupils that I teach. But I think it's important to remember that everyone has their own view of what history teaching is, and everyone works in a different context, and what works in one context might not work in another. So you just need to try out ideas in your own context. But I do hope that these ideas might just get you thinking. So one thing to do when it comes to historical scholarship or interpretations is to compare pupils' newly acquired knowledge about an event with an interpretation to see how far it agrees. So let's look at some examples of how we might do this. So this inquiry was written by a teacher that I have worked with closely, Elena Stevens, who works on the south coast of England, and I really like what she's done here. So she starts with the historian Hugh Trevor Roper, and she tells her pupils that this is historian Hugh Trevor Roper, and although he was mainly concerned with the history of Britain and Nazi Germany, he had some very interesting things to say about the history of Africa. In 1963, he believed that there was no African history before the West went there. This is a quote from him. He said, "There is only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is largely darkness. History, I believe, is essentially a form of movement. But African history is just barbarous tribes in irrelevant corners of the globe." Now, that's quite a stark statement from Hugh Trevor Roper. And we tell the pupils that Trevor Roper believed there was just no point in studying African history before the arrival of the Europeans in Africa in the 1880s because nothing was going on. There was no movement, no trade or development. So in this lesson, the pupils see whether Trevor Roper's arguments stand up to analysis. So we need to start by giving pupils new knowledge that they can use to evaluate Trevor Roper's argument. And here, all they do is they read some statements about African trade and movement before 1900, and they colour code them using different colours if they think that the box is an example of trade in useful objects or special objects or people or ideas. And they're given a sheet that looks like this. So the first one, during the 14th century in particular, the African kingdom of Mali was very wealthy, partly because it controlled the gold-rich region of northwest Africa. Gold was in particular demand in places like Spain and Italy because these countries wanted to use gold to make their currency. So the people from Mali traded gold with the Spanish and the Italians. Now that is trade in a special or unique object. So the pupils read through these and they colour code them accordingly. For extra access, some pupils are given less statements with less writing. For more access, some pupils are given more information from A-level textbooks. Okay, and essentially, they complete their version like this, and it has provided them with new knowledge that there was lots of trade and movement within and beyond Africa before the end of the 19th century. The next thing they do is, for each clue, they need to plot the route of trade on this map. So all they do is they draw an arrow where the object, person or idea came from, and they draw an arrow where it ended up, and they could then draw their arrows in the 4 different colours that they use to colour code the statements in the boxes on the previous slide. So we could have a nice arrow from going from Mali down here right up to Portugal, and we could colour code that and we could annotate that. And by doing this, let's face it, kids like geography because it's colouring in, and here they're colouring in with a bit more effect and a bit more knowledge, aren't they? So they can spend some time annotating and drawing arrows on their maps, and they can see how well connected Africa was before 1900. So, having done this, we can go back to Hugh Trevor Roper's interpretation, and we can ask if he was right that African history was characterised by a complete lack of trade and movement. And we can have a class discussion. You need to insist that they provide precise examples that they've got to challenge his interpretation. And we can hear their answers, and we can try and get them to extend their answers, their oral answers in class, and we can really prove Hugh Trevor Roper to be wrong. But then, if we want to think a bit more deeply, we can ask, well, why did he get it so wrong? Why might he have said this in 1963? Okay? And this gets us into thinking about the context an interpretation is created in. Now, that's pretty difficult, or I think it would be. So it's important to give the pupils a leg up. So here are some explanations to match up. So he might have had this view because he was following the arguments of previous writers, and the fact that at this point the knowledge of African kingdoms was quite limited. That another reason was that Europe colonised parts of Africa during the 19th century, and that this was the general view amongst historians. And the pupils can match up the red boxes to the statements on the right that substantiate those points. Like this. So, having discussed the fact that Hugh Trevor Roper made his comments in the context of his time and talked about that, we can then get our pupils to respond to Hugh Trevor Roper to explain why they think what they think of his statement, and they can use specific evidence and explanation to back up their points. So in that last example, you can see that we used pupils' contextual knowledge to compare to an interpretation to see how much they agreed with it. Okay? Along similar lines, this is another example that perhaps is interpretations light, but it ends in heavy interpretations work. So this example starts with the classic inquiry into why did World War I happen? Okay, that classic question. Why did World War I happen in 1914? So the pupils acquire the knowledge of the different causes of World War I as they normally would, and they then sort out their courses in the normal way that you would, i.e. they might sort them under big headings of nationalism and empires and alliances and armed forces, and they then can see that these reasons, they're classifying reasons, aren't they? And they're seeing how they interlinked, and the trigger reason caused the war to explode the barrels of gunpowder. You know, the classic example. So that's a why question. But at the end, instead of answering the causal essay question of why did World War I break out, what I tended to do was use this newsreel interpretation. So this clip comes from a newsreel made in the 1930s. So it clearly is made after the event, and it clearly is an interpretation. And I play it to the pupils, and they use their acquired knowledge of the causes of World War I to spot the mistakes in it. I wonder if you can.
The Archduke Ferdinand, Emperor's heir and nephew, visited Sarajevo in unfriendly Serbia. This unique picture shows him only 10 minutes before a Serbian fanatic hurled the fatal bomb, the bomb that blew the Archduke into eternity and shattered the peace of Europe. From this wreckage leapt the war flames that engulfed the world.
Okay, now I hope you heard that. So here's the transcript if you didn't hear the YouTube clip. And it's quite interesting because Franz Ferdinand, the emperor's heir and nephew, visited Sarajevo, but it wasn't in unfriendly Serbia, it was in unfriendly Bosnia. And this unique picture does show him 10 minutes before a fanatic held a bomb, but it wasn't a fatal bomb, and the bomb didn't blow the Archduke into eternity and shatter the peace of Europe. We know that was Gavrilo Princip with his 2 bullets that shot Franz Ferdinand and his wife. And also, this clip makes it appear that this was the only cause of the war, or the main cause of the war, where it says, from this wreckage leapt the war flames that engulfed the world. So, having spotted the mistakes, the pupils then move on and write a more accurate version. Then what they do is, I always ask them to rewrite the newsreel without mistakes, explaining the most important reasons why the war broke out. Sometimes, if I had access to IT, I'd get them to make their own newsreel, and I would give them a number of images that they could use to make their newsreel and record their voiceover, but I only would allow them to use 3 images. So here are some of the images that I might ask them to use. Now, this example is again using their contextual knowledge to compare to a interpretation. And I don't know about you, but I can't remember who used this phrase, but someone once said to me that the whole purpose of school's history is to make pupils crap detectors, to be critical, to spot things they don't trust. And I think that this is a good example of this. This final example takes a historian's scholarship. It uses Orlando Figes' classic work on the storming of the Winter Palace, found in his award-winning book called A People's Tragedy. The inquiry question is, does Figes' interpretation of the storming of the Winter Palace need a second glance? So, having taught this loads before, I tell the pupils what a great book it is. I take the book in and I hold it up to them, and that on page 400 and something or other, I can't remember the page, it describes the storming of the Winter Palace. So I turn in the book to the page. And then I read through an extract about the storming, this extract here, and the pupils have to choose some words that describe the way in which Figes describes the storming. And if you read through the extract, it clearly is a shambolic, disorganised, incompetent affair. So having established this and Figes' interpretation of the storming being disorganised, shambolic, etc., we analyse his style of writing, but we do a bit of background work on grammar. So I asked the pupils to find the adjective in the following sentence. At lunchtime, teachers are often really annoying. They're allowed in at the front of the canteen queue. And the adjective is annoying. Okay, and then we have a chat about, is the person writing this sentence writing it from a teacher's or a pupil's opinion? And clearly, this is annoying to pupils, but not to teachers. So we can see that the sentence has got a slant. Okay? The adjective shows the writer's opinion or inference, and without the adjective, it's a statement of fact. The teachers are allowed in at the front of the canteen queue. So having established this, so then we move back to Figes is extract, and I ask the pupils to find the adjective in the account. And if you look at the second sentence in the subordinate clause, you can see then there was an even more frustrating problem. The assault on the Winter Palace was due to begin with the heavy field guns of the Peter and Paul fortress, but at the final moment these were discovered to be rusty museum pieces which couldn't be fired. Soldiers were hastily sent to drag alternative cannons up to the fortresses, but when they arrived it turned out there were no suitable shells for them. So this statement that it was even more frustrating for the Bolsheviks is really Figes' inference and not necessarily a statement of fact. How did he know that this was even more frustrating than the late arrival of the sailors? And then we look at the next part of Figes' description. He says, or he writes, even more surreal was the panic created by the seemingly simple task of raising a lantern to the top of the fortress's flagpole to signal the start of the attack. When the moment actually arrived, no red lantern could be found. And then I asked the class, bearing in mind that there are lots and lots of Bolsheviks waiting at the Peter and Paul fortress for the start of the attack, if this was truly a major panic, how many men would go out looking for this lantern if they were panic stricken? And we have a chat, 2, 5, 10, 20, kids vote, and then I read them the next part of the extract. And what this essentially tells us is that one Bolshevik, okay, the Bolshevik in charge went out in search of this lamp. And then Figes says that he got lost in the muddy bog and he couldn't find the lamp, but only one. So was there really a panic, or is this Figes' spin on the story? Is it his construction? And we have a chat about that. Was it a panic or is it Figes' opinion? And then what we've done is we've established that this extract is very much a historian's construct. And we've looked very much at the style and tone. And what we do next is we go on to compare this extract with another interpretation, the film The Storming of the Winter Palace from 1927, and then we look at other accounts from eyewitnesses and we check to see if Figes had done his homework, and we find that he did do his homework. But here we've established the style and tone of a historian's extract. So that's it from me. I hope you found this useful. Pretty much all of the examples that we've used today can be found on my website, History Resource Cupboard. And if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in contact. My email address is richard@historyresourcecupboard. Thanks so much.